They didn't experience your love as safety. They experienced it as pressure, not because you were overwhelming, but because their system couldn't tell the difference. And that's where everything gets misunderstood. Because from your side, you were consistent, you were present, you were clear. There were no games, no mixed signals, no instability. And that's exactly what made it feel safe to you. But for them, that same consistency didn't register the same way. It didn't feel neutral. It didn't feel grounding. It felt activating, not loudly, not in a way they could explain, but in their body. Subtle shifts, tension where there wasn't tension before, a sense of being watched, even when you weren't watching, a feeling of expectation, even when you weren't demanding anything. And that's where the distortion begins. Because the mind doesn't just process what's happening, it interprets it based on what it already knows. And if their system learned early on that closeness comes with pressure, then even calm connection can feel like the beginning of something they need to prepare for, not consciously, automatically, because their body doesn't separate past from present the way logic does. It just recognizes patterns and reacts. So when you show up consistently, their system doesn't just see stability. It scans for what that stability might lead to. More closeness, more expectation, more emotional exposure. And instead of reading that as safety, it reads it as escalation. Not something to relax into, but something to brace for. And that's the part that's almost invisible from the outside. Because nothing you're doing looks threatening. Nothing you're saying carries pressure. But internally, their system is responding, as if something is building, as if something is about to require more than they can comfortably give. And once that feeling starts, the mind tries to make sense of it. Because discomfort always looks for a reason. It doesn't just sit there, it explains itself. So instead of recognizing, this feels unfamiliar, it translates it into something clearer. This is too much. This is moving too fast. This doesn't feel right. And those thoughts feel true, not because they are accurate, but because they match what their body is experiencing. And this is where the shift happens. Not because your behavior changed, but because their perception did. Because now, they're no longer responding to what you're actually doing. They're responding to what your presence represents inside their system. And what it represents is closeness they don't yet feel safe holding. So the connection starts to feel different. On their side, heavier, more intense, even if nothing externally changed. And from your side, that's where confusion begins. Because you're still showing up the same way, still steady, still grounded, still clear. But suddenly, they're pulling back, creating space, acting like something shifted when nothing actually did. And that's the disconnect. Because something did shift, just not where you can see it. It shifted in how they're experiencing you. Because what felt like safety to you registered as threat to them. Not a real threat, but a familiar one. The kind their system learned to protect against before they ever had words for it. And once that switch flips, everything starts getting filtered through it. Your presence feels heavier. Your consistency feels like expectation. Your openness feels like something they'll eventually have to match. And matching it feels like something they're not ready for. So the system does what it's always done. It creates distance, not as rejection, but as regulation, to bring everything back to a level that feels manageable again. Because staying close means staying inside that activation. And they don't yet know how to do that without interpreting it as danger. So they step back, not because you were unsafe, but because their system couldn't recognize safety in what you were offering. And that's why it feels so confusing, because nothing you did should have caused distance. But you weren't dealing with behavior. You were dealing with perception. And perception, when it's shaped by past experience, doesn't always reflect what's actually happening. It reflects what feels familiar, even if what's familiar is what keeps them from staying. Because once their system registers something as too much, even subtly, it doesn't go back to neutral on its own. It stays alert, watching, tracking, trying to anticipate what might come next. And this is where the experience of you changes, not externally, internally, because now they're not just engaging with you, they're monitoring how they feel. While engaging with you, every interaction becomes something they notice, not in a relaxed way, but in a measured one. How do I feel right now? Is this getting heavier? Am I being pulled into something? And the more they check, the more they find, because attention amplifies sensation. So small feelings that would normally pass start to stand out. A slight tension in their chest, a moment where they don't know what to say next, a pause that feels longer than it actually is. And instead of letting those moments move, their mind labels them. This feels off. This feels like pressure. This feels like something I need to manage. And once something is labeled like that, it doesn't shrink. It grows. Because now, it has meaning attached to it. And meaning changes perception. Because they're no longer just experiencing the moment. They're interpreting it through a filter that's already slightly activated. So even neutral things start to feel loaded. A message from you doesn't just feel like a message. It feels like something they need to respond to correctly. Your consistency doesn't just feel like stability. It feels like something that's building toward expectation. Your presence doesn't just feel like closeness. It feels like something that's increasing the chance of emotional demand, even if none of that is actually happening. Because again, this isn't about reality. It's about interpretation. And interpretation follows feeling, not logic. So the more activated their system becomes, the more their mind tries to justify it. Because the brain doesn't like unexplained discomfort. It needs a reason, something it can point to and say, that's why this doesn't feel right. And slowly, that reason becomes you, not in a blaming way, but in a convincing way. This connection feels intense. This is moving too fast. I don't think I'm ready for this. And those thoughts feel grounded. They feel like clarity because they match what their body is experiencing. But the origin isn't your behavior. It's the activation underneath it. And this is where the distance begins to form, not suddenly, but through small adjustments. They take longer to respond. They keep conversations lighter. They avoid depth, where it used to flow naturally, not because they don't want it, but because depth increases the activation. It brings them closer to the feeling they're trying to regulate. So they reduce it gently, subtly, until the interaction feels manageable again. But here's the part that complicates everything. Because even as they create distance, the relief they feel confirms their perception. It reinforces it. Because now they step back and their system settles slightly. Less tension, less pressure, less internal noise. And that shift feels real, noticeable. So the mind connects it. See, this is better. This is what I needed. I just needed space. And that conclusion locks the pattern in further. Because now, distance doesn't just feel like preference. It feels like the solution to a problem they believe came from the connection, even though the problem was how their system interpreted the connection. And this is where things become harder to reverse. Because once distance feels like relief, closeness starts to feel like risk, not consciously, but consistently. So even if part of them still values the connection, still enjoys you, still recognizes something real, another part is now cautious, guarded, watching for signs that things might become too much again. And because they're watching, they keep finding small things that confirm it. A longer conversation, a deeper question, a moment of emotional openness. All normal, all healthy, but now, filtered differently, through a system that's already slightly braced. And that's how the distortion deepens, because it becomes self-reinforcing. They feel something. They interpret it as pressure. They create distance. They feel relief. And that relief proves to them that the pressure was real, even when it wasn't coming from you. And over time, this doesn't just affect how they respond, it affects how they see the connection. Because now, it's no longer experienced as something calm and steady. It's experienced as something that could become too much, something they have to manage, something they have to pace, or step away from. And from your side, this is where everything starts to feel inconsistent, because nothing you're doing explains the shift. You didn't change. The connection didn't suddenly escalate, but their experience of it did, quietly, internally. And once that internal shift happens, their behavior follows it, not because they decided to pull away, but because distance feels like the only way to bring their system back to a place that feels manageable again. And that's why it never feels like a clear break. It feels like a slow fade, a gradual pulling back, a subtle change in energy you can feel, but can't fully explain. Because what you're responding to isn't what they're doing, it's what they're experiencing. And what they're experiencing is a connection that feels different on the inside than it looks on the outside. Because even as they create distance, something doesn't fully switch off. The part of them that felt something with you is still there, still aware of what the connection was, still holding the sense that it wasn't imagined. And that's where the contradiction begins. Because now, two different experiences are happening at the same time. One part of them feels the pull toward you, not intensely, not in a way that takes over, but steadily, a quiet recognition that something about you felt different, easier in some ways, more real, less forced. And that part doesn't interpret your presence as threat. It experiences it as connection, something it doesn't come across often, something it doesn't easily dismiss. But at the same time, another part of them is still activated, still reading closeness as pressure, still anticipating what staying connected might require, still trying to keep everything within a range that feels manageable. And these two parts don't merge. They don't balance each other out. They pull in different directions. One moves toward, the other pulls back, and neither one fully wins. So what you see is inconsistency, but what's actually happening is internal conflict, because the part that feels connection doesn't disappear just because distance is created. If anything, distance makes it more noticeable, because now there's space to feel it, to think about it, to remember the moments that felt natural, unforced, where nothing had to be managed. And those memories don't feel threatening. They feel calm, grounded, like something that could have continued if everything stayed at that level. But that's the problem, because in their system, nothing stays at that level. Closeness doesn't stay steady. It escalates. It deepens. It eventually asks for more. More presence, more openness, more emotional availability. And that expectation, even if it hasn't happened yet, is already being anticipated, because their system isn't just responding to now, It's predicting what comes next. And what comes next feels like something they won't be able to regulate. So the part of them that feels connection gets interrupted, not dismissed, interrupted by the part that says, if this continues, it won't stay easy. It will become something I have to manage. It will turn into pressure. And that prediction carries more weight than the present moment because it feels safer to act on what might happen than to stay inside something that could become overwhelming later. So they step back, not because the connection faded, but because it didn't. And that's what makes it complicated. Because from your side, it looks like they lost interest, like something changed in how they felt. But internally, they're still holding both. The part that recognizes you and the part that's trying to regulate the feeling of closeness before it gets stronger. And that creates a very specific pattern. They stay aware of you, but they limit engagement. They think about reaching out, but don't follow through. They revisit the connection internally, but don't re-enter it externally. Because engaging again means stepping back into the same activation their system is trying to avoid. And this is where attachment forms, without safety, because the connection matters, but it doesn't feel stable enough to move toward freely. So it stays in a controlled space, felt, but not expressed, remembered, but not rebuilt. And over time, that controlled distance becomes the only way they know how to hold it, close enough to not fully lose it, far enough to not feel overwhelmed by it. But that space isn't sustainable because holding connection without movement creates tension. The part that feels something doesn't disappear. It waits, quietly, not demanding anything, just present. And the longer it stays there, the harder it becomes to fully convince themselves that distance is the right choice. Because now, they're not just reacting to activation. They're aware of what they're stepping away from. And that awareness doesn't align easily with the distance they're maintaining. So the conflict deepens, not outwardly, internally, because now they can't fully say, this isn't right for me. But they also can't say, I feel safe staying in this. So they stay in between. Again, connected, but not moving closer. Aware, but not acting on it. Feeling something, but regulating it through distance. And from the outside, it looks unclear. But from the inside, it's very specific. They're not choosing between you and something else. They're choosing between connection and the way their system experiences it. And until those two align, distance feels like the only way to keep everything manageable, even if it means not fully staying in something that mattered. Because holding something at a distance while still feeling it creates pressure over time, not immediately. At first, the space helps. It lowers the activation, brings everything back to a level that feels manageable. And for a while, that feels like the right move, like they handled it correctly. But the connection doesn't disappear just because they stepped away from it. It stays quieter, less active, but still present. And over time, that quiet presence starts to shift because now it's not just something they felt, it's something they remember, something they compare against without trying to. Other interactions feel easier, but flatter, more controlled, but less real, less activating, but also less meaningful. And that contrast doesn't go unnoticed because now they're not just avoiding discomfort, they're becoming aware of what that avoidance removed. And that awareness changes the weight of everything because now distance doesn't just feel like relief. It feels like limitation, like something is missing that used to be there. And that's where the pressure begins. Not from you, from within. because the part of them that felt connection is still there, and now it has more space to be noticed, more space to ask questions. Why did I pull away? Was it actually too much? Or did it just feel like it? Could I have stayed in it if I handled it differently? And those questions don't resolve easily because the answers challenge the pattern they've relied on, the one that says distance equals safety, because now distance doesn't feel entirely safe anymore. It feels incomplete, and that creates a new kind of tension, not just activation, but conflict with their own response, because part of them is starting to see it, that what they experienced as threat wasn't actually coming from you. It was coming from how their system interpreted closeness. And once that realization starts to form, even slightly, it destabilizes everything, because now they can't fully stand on the idea that pulling away was the only option, but they also don't fully trust themselves to do it differently yet. So they sit in between again. But this time, it feels heavier, because now it's not just about managing feeling, it's about questioning their own pattern. Why does something real feel like something I need to escape? Why does calm connection feel like pressure? Why can't I just stay? And those questions don't come with immediate answers. They come with awareness. And awareness doesn't soothe the system, it exposes it. Because now, they're not just reacting automatically, they're seeing the reaction as it happens. And that creates friction, because the part of them that wants connection is now more visible, more defined, less easy to ignore. But the part that feels threatened is still just as active, still responding the same way, still pulling back when things feel too close. And that's where the pressure sharpens, because now they're not just pulled in two directions, they're aware of it fully. And awareness without resolution feels unstable, because now every option has weight. Move toward the connection and risk activation again. Stay away and sit with the awareness that something real was left behind. And that awareness slowly turns into something deeper. Loss, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, because now they're not just remembering the connection, they're understanding it, what it was, what it offered, what it required, and what they couldn't stay inside of. And that understanding makes the distance feel different, not just necessary, but costly, because now they can see both sides, what they protected and what they gave up to protect it. And that realization doesn't force action, but it removes certainty, because now they can't fully believe that closeness equals danger, but they also don't fully feel safe, proving otherwise. So they stay in tension, holding both truths. Closeness felt real, closeness felt threatening, and until one of those becomes stronger than the other, they remain where they are, not moving forward, not fully letting go, just aware of something that mattered, and something inside them that couldn't stay with it.